The peace of Christ be with you all. Let's practice that again in sign language. The peace of Christ be with you and also with you. Today's gospel story, as we've already heard and observed, is one of thirst and quenching and wondering and witnessing. But I'm going to begin with a couple of personal stories from about 13 and a half years ago. In 2009, I had a sabbatical after 7 years of ministry in my previous pastorate. And one big goal of that sabbatical was to train for and then run a marathon. And Bob decided to join me on this venture. So for a stretch of months, we were regularly out on training runs, both separately and together, at varying lengths of distance that we increased over time. Because our children were so little then, we did often alternate which days that we would go out on these training runs. And there was this particular day, I think it was a Saturday, and Bob went out. It was his turn. So he went out. He got a little bit later start in the day, and the heat of the day was starting to press in on his training time. I remember him coming home, and he looked, after he was done, and he looked kind of grayish green, and not a pretty sight. No offense, dear. He just was not feeling well. He had gotten partially dehydrated and was showing and feeling the effects of that. After getting a bit of water and cleaning up just a little bit, he then was in bed with chills and aches and fever and just in rough shape for the rest of the afternoon and evening. Believe it or not, that was not our only experience of difficulty with having enough water during this stretch of training months. Just a few weeks before our race, we went out together for our longest training run, which was about 21 miles. We had our general course mapped out, and we had our snacks placed strategically in our pockets, and we had our handy-dandy running water bottles. But we got to about mile 18, and we both started not feeling very well, and we had run out of water prematurely. I think it was a warmer day than we had anticipated, so we were using a bit more water than we thought. We were both kind of wobbly and feeling a bit faint, and we were still a few miles from home, and I don't remember if either one of us had a phone on us, but we didn't want to call someone to come and pick us up. We didn't want to fail on this last training run. So we were trying to tough it out somehow and finish. We were on a stretch of road that didn't have very many houses on it, but we did come up upon a farmhouse, and we saw a spigot and a hose, and we were desperate. We were a bit timid and embarrassed, but because we were desperate, we knocked on the door, and there was no answer. So we knocked again, no answer. Do we dare take some water from this spigot and hose without permission? But just then, the owner came walking from out of somewhere, I don't even remember where, and we humbly and desperately asked if we could use her hose and water, and she kindly allowed us. Thanks be to God and to her. We took in some drink, and then we started again toward home. It was, the last few miles were a hard, long slog of sort of sputtered running and walking, but we eventually made it home. And we had learned some important lessons about water and thirst and its signals, the limits of our bodies, and the limits of ourselves. We needed help. We didn't have a well, but we did find a spigot and a hose and a generous stranger. Thanks be to God. These stories and our scripture from John today remind me of the absolute necessity of water. Water is essential to life. We all know this, but sometimes we take this for granted, and we need to be reminded. Our Creator's design of the human body is an absolute reminder of this. You've probably heard that the human body is made up of a huge percentage of water. And if you Google that, you'll get varying answers. But on average, our bodies are made up of 60 to 65% water. And if we break that down more specifically, our brains are made up of about 73% water. Our muscles and kidneys are about 79% water. Our skin, about 64%. And even our bones, these hard bones, are 31% water. Water helps to fill our cells. It helps our blood to be able to flow. It helps to regulate our body temperature, helps to produce saliva and support our digestion. It flushes out waste. It lubricates our joints. And it cushions our spinal cord and brain. Water is essential to life. So what happens when we get thirsty and we start to mess with this precious balance of the water in our systems that help us to live and breathe and exist? Aside from our mouths and our throats getting dry and parched, we can see effects of dizziness. We can experience fast heart rate, fever, chills, somewhat like Bob experienced. We can stop sweating and stop urinating. Our blood can thicken, which makes our heart work harder, and we can have chest pain or worse. Our electrolytes can get out of balance, and that, again, affects our heart. Some of the milder effects, albeit unpleasant, are signals to help us to pay attention, to slow down, and to tend to ourselves. Fatigue, loss of focus and alertness, effects on our short-term memory, and we can get this altered state of mood, especially anger and irritability. Who knew that a cup or 2 or 3 of cool water might just help us not to get so irritated with life? Or maybe if we quench our thirst, we won't maybe get quite so irritated with our fellow human beings and the situations we face. How many of you have heard of the term hangry, Hangry? How many of you have felt hangry before? Okay. I kind of wish that we could have something that indicates so hangry is hungry and angry smashed together, right? And it recognizes how hunger can affect our mood, and we can get kind of angry. I wish there was a term that recognized when we're thirsty, and that might lead to some anger, but thangry or thiangry doesn't quite have the same ring as hangry. So from now on, when you think of hangry, think hunger and thirst together. How many of you have heard of the acronym HALT, H-A-L-T? Yeah. So this stands for hungry, H for hungry, A for angry, L for lonely, T for tired. HALT. And this is something that's used in counseling or 12-step programs or just self-care as a way of recognizing these factors that put us that indicate that we're under stress, that indicate that our anxiety might be higher, we might be more irritable, we might not make the best decisions, and so we're to halt and pay attention to that. Again, I wish that that we could indicate thirst as a part of this as well, but halt doesn't have the same indication to us to stop. So as you think of halt in the future, think of hungry and thirsty. The implications of thirst go further than our physical need for water. And I want us to consider today how thirst is a gift, how thirst can be our teacher. Thirst signals us to slow down, to stop, or to halt. We are signaled to slow down so that we can rest and take care. If our thirst is especially strong, it can signal to us that we're in danger of being hurt, or potentially hurting others. Remember that when we're especially parched, we can become distracted and lose focus and even become irritable and angry. And in those times, we have the potential to hurt ourselves and to hurt others. And even if our thirst is more social and spiritual in nature, we can sometimes be in danger of hurting ourselves or hurting others. So we want to pay attention. Thirst teaches us about vulnerability and the limits of our bodies, whether it be a stretch in bed for a few hours with shivers and aches from dehydration or overheating, or for a longer stretch of recovery, we can receive the gift of perspective and clarity. I would venture that many or most of us have experienced a few days in bed with the flu or another illness, or weeks recovering from a broken bone, or longer journeys with cancer or chronic illness or mental health struggles. And such experiences can take us to the limits of our bodies, to the limits of our emotions. In these times, we might recognize our humanity in a different way, in its fullness and all its vulnerability. When we face the limits and the fragilities of our physical bodies in very visceral ways, we are often drawn into a different place, a place of deep longings and spiritual thirst, a place of existential questions, and sometimes crying out to God in lament, or in thanksgiving, or in both. Humanity is created in the image of God, and in this we are inherently connected with our Creator. As we face the fullness and the limits of our humanity, a deeper spiritual thirst can emerge. In those parched places, our thirst helps us to remember our longing to be connected to and in relationship with, protected by, and led by, and shaped by the God who made us. Early in Lent, we were reminded of Jesus' journey into the parched places of the wilderness. He was tested by the limits of his body, for sure, but also his spirit. There's no doubt that he faced deep longings and was likely asking existential questions and crying out to God. Jesus emerged hungry and thirsty, maybe even hangry, but also in touch with greater depths and clarity of his calling. Now to this beautiful story of thirst and quenching captured in John. Jesus comes with thirst to Jacob's well. He became tired and thirsty along the way, just like the disciples, just like the rest of us would if we were on a similar journey. He pays attention to his thirst. He stops and takes rest. In this, he identifies with the fullness of his humanity. As I think about Jesus sitting there at the well, tired and thirsty, alone in the heat of the day, I wonder, what was he feeling and thinking? He might have been thinking, a moment alone, thanks be to God. But he also might have been thinking in these parched moments, I wonder if it took his mind and his heart back to the treacherous time in the wilderness. Was his current thirst reminding him of only the pain and the vulnerability of those days and nights? Or was he also remembering how he connected with God, how he survived and emerged with greater clarity of next steps of his mission? So as Jesus rests, parched and pondering, along comes a woman, a Samaritan woman. She comes with her own thirst. And before a conversation even ensues, we can recognize her thirst. She comes with a whole set of vulnerabilities. We don't exactly know why, but she comes alone and not with a community of other women, which would have been fairly customary at the time. She comes around noon in the heat of the day. And this well was probably on a plot of land a bit outside of the city. And so she had made it there, but she will have to make her way back carrying heavy water alone in the heat of the day. Yet, seeing a man there, she takes a risk. She's thirsty, and she still bravely approaches. It's a bit risky as a woman to be there alone with a man, and then she also recognizes that Jesus is a Jew. A Jewish man and a Samaritan woman speaking to one another is scandalous. There was bitter enmity between the Jews and Samaritans for centuries. Even so, there they are, two thirsty people. Jesus followed his physical thirst and the signals to need to stop and take rest. And Jesus asked her for a drink of water. As he engages her further beyond their shared physical thirst and need for water, more layers of thirst are revealed. Her social and spiritual thirst becomes evident. She has been through 5 husbands, and now is with a 6th man that is not her husband. We don't know the circumstances of all these relationships, but we do know that women did not have the power or recourse to divorce in that day, and that women could be easily dismissed from a marriage. Or she could have very well lost several husbands to death, and it was essential to remarry. Or maybe it was a combination of all of these circumstances. Whatever the case may be, we can gather that she was battered and bruised by loss and potentially carrying much shame. Yet Jesus chooses her to ask for a drink and to have a lengthy conversation with. Jesus shares with her prophetically about her life. And this transforms this particular hot and lonely trip to the well for daily water into a life-changing conversation. She remembers her belief, and she remembers her worship. She remembers the hope in a Messiah to come. And then Jesus unexpectedly reveals to her that he indeed is that hope, the very giver of living water that will forever quench her thirst, and for the thirst of all those who dare to follow and worship in spirit and truth. It was not an accident that Jesus chose this route on the way back to Galilee. This was a divine necessity that Jesus and the disciples go through enemy territory of Samaria. And it wasn't just to save steps or time on the journey, but for the purpose of two thirsty people having a conversation and all that happens afterward. It marks a shift in Jesus' mission. It marks a broadening and a clarifying that the good news and living water is to be barrier breaking. Jesus is proclaiming that the good news is not only for those who explicitly await the Messiah, but for all those who have no voice, the sick, sinners, foreigners, women, children. Jesus, giver of living water, is declaring that all are valued and called to full personhood, to their full humanity. Out of her many layers of thirst and the promise of living water, this vulnerable woman with no real voice in her society is now able to raise her voice in witness to the one who offers not just drink, but life-altering, forever-quenching living water. Through her thirst, through her risk, through her witness, her whole community is quenched and changed. Thirst is a driving need in this story. Thirst is a driving need in all of our lives. Let's remember together that it's an important signal to us, that it's okay to pay attention to stop, slow down, halt, rest, and take care. Let's remember that ultimately our thirst reminds us of our need for living water, and that the gift of this living water is offered graciously and freely to each one of us. Let's remember to raise our voices in witness to those moments, however big or however small, when we have been quenched and shaped by living water. May this song that we are about to sing together remind us of the many different ways that living water shapes us. Amen.